11 bodies were discovered between 2:14 and 4:03 a.m. Some lay in the snow beside parked vehicles, their doors still open. Others were inside the bar, collapsed beneath tables and along the length of the counter. One body was found behind the building, slumped against the brick wall, as if the man had tried to steady himself before losing strength. It was winter, 1981. The location was a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where most people recognize each other's trucks before they recognize faces. By sunrise, 11 men were dead. By noon, the story had already begun to simplify. In official summaries, the incident would later be described as a late-night shooting following a disturbance at a local bar. That description removed the order of events, the pauses, the decisions, and the moments where everything could have stopped. It also removed the cause, not the weapon. The cause. There was no robbery, no organized crime, no drugs moving through the building, no political motive. There was no single plan and no single shooter acting alone. What triggered the night was a sentence spoken aloud in a crowded room. A sentence that lasted no more than a few seconds. A sentence that no one thought would matter. The bar sat on the edge of town, just off a county road that cut through farmland and small clusters of houses. It had been there for decades, changing names, but not owners. The sign outside flickered when the wind was strong. Inside, the lighting was low enough that faces blended together after midnight. On weekends, it was the only place open past 11. On weeknights, it attracted the same group of men. Factory workers, truck drivers, farmhands, a few locals who drank every night, and a few who only drank when they were already angry. That Friday night was colder than usual. Snow had started falling just before dark and hadn't stopped. By 9 p.m., the parking lot was nearly full. By 10:30, the room was loud enough that conversations overlapped and words lost their edges. Alcohol moved faster than usual. Nobody was celebrating anything. There was no event. People were there because there was nowhere else to go. Around 11:40 p.m., a man later identified as the first victim arrived with 2 friends. He had been drinking earlier in the evening at another location. Witnesses would later say he was already irritated when he walked in, though nobody could explain why. He ordered immediately and stood at the bar instead of taking a table. He leaned into other patrons as he spoke, crowding space that wasn't his. No one asked him to move. 20 minutes later, another group entered. Among them was a man who had grown up in the town and had known several people in the room since childhood. He recognized the first man, but had never spoken to him before. They did not greet each other. There was no history between them. There was no reason for one to notice the other. Shortly after midnight, as glasses were being cleared and refilled, the first man turned slightly and said something toward the group behind him. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was loud enough to be heard and casual enough to be dismissed. The sentence included an insult, personal, specific, and unnecessary. For a moment, nothing happened. That pause would matter later. No one intervened, no one corrected him, no one laughed. The man who heard the remark looked at him and responded with a single sentence of his own. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. The words were crude. The tone was flat. Several people nearby heard enough to understand that the conversation had crossed a line. Someone suggested stepping outside. Someone else said it wasn't worth it. Drinks were set down. A chair scraped the floor. The room shifted its attention, then returned to its noise. The music continued. The first punch was thrown at 12:17 a.m. It did not land cleanly. It did not end the argument. It did not draw security. because there was no security. The bartender shouted once and then stopped. Two men were separated. One stumbled backward into another group. A glass broke. Someone fell. When the first gun was drawn, no one noticed immediately. By the time the second gun appeared, the room had already begun to divide. People backing toward exits, others frozen in place, some stepping forward instead of away. The shots that followed were not rapid. They were spaced out. There was time between them. Time to leave. Time to hide. Time to make decisions that would later be questioned. None of those decisions stopped what came next. The first body hit the floor at 12:21 a.m. By 12:28, the parking lot was already filling with the injured. This was not a single moment. It was a chain. What followed was not panic, but confusion. The slower and more dangerous state where people misread what is happening around them and act on incomplete information. Because after the first body fell, the sound in the room did not stop. The music continued for several seconds. Voices overlapped, and several patrons believed the noise had come from outside or from something falling. And that misunderstanding delayed the first wave of exits just long enough for the situation to harden, because the man who fired the initial shot did not leave. He stayed where he was, weapon still visible, breathing heavy, looking around the room as if waiting for someone to challenge him. And someone did. Not intentionally, not heroically, but by stepping in the wrong direction at the wrong time, which triggered the second shot, then a third. And when the second weapon was raised by a different individual across the room, the logic of the night changed entirely, because now no one was responding to a single threat. They were reacting to noise, movement, and fear. And in that environment, every gesture became suspect, every raised hand looked like intent, and every attempt to intervene was interpreted as escalation. So when one man tried to pull, another toward the back exit. He was shot through the shoulder, and when a third man attempted to duck behind the bar, he was hit twice before he reached the floor. And when someone shouted that there were children outside in a car waiting, the words were lost under another gunshot that echoed longer than the rest, because by then the front windows had shattered, and the sound was no longer contained. It was spilling into the night and into the parking lot where people who had already fled were now realizing that the danger was not behind them, but spreading outward, because shots were fired through the open door, then through a windshield, then into the dark, where no one could see clearly who was moving and who was already down. And at least two of the men later found dead outside had not been part of the original argument at all. They had been trying to leave when they were struck by rounds fired without a clear target, because by that point, no one inside was aiming. They were reacting, and reacting late. And when the bar finally went quiet, it was not because the threat had ended, but because everyone who could move had already done so, leaving behind bodies and silence and a building that no longer functioned as a space, only as a container for what had happened. And it was in that silence that one of the shooters exited through the back, stepped into the snow, slipped, recovered, and disappeared between two houses without being followed, because no one was chasing anyone anymore. They were counting breaths and blood loss and trying to understand how a night that had no plan and no destination had arrived at a point where 11 men would not go home. And when the first emergency call finally reached dispatch, it was fragmented and inaccurate, describing multiple shooters, dozens of victims, an active siege, and those early errors would shape the response that arrived too late to change the outcome, but early enough to control the narrative, because by the time police, vehicles blocked the road, and officers entered the building with weapons drawn, the event was already over, and what remained was interpretation, which would soon begin to compress the night into something smaller, something easier to explain, something that would remove the pauses, the delays, and the decisions that allowed the number to climb from 1 to 11. The first officers entered through the front just after 12. 50 stepping around broken glass and overturned stools, weapons raised but with nowhere left to point them, because the threat they had been warned about no longer had a shape, only a residue, and the building offered no clarity, only angles and shadows and bodies positioned in ways that did not explain themselves. One behind the bar with hands still clenched, another near the door with keys in his pocket. 2 more near the windows where the glass had exploded outward. And it took several minutes before anyone began checking pulses because training had prepared them for an active scene, not an ended one. And that delay mattered for at least one man who was still breathing when officers arrived, and was not breathing when paramedics were finally cleared to enter. Because the early radio traffic had exaggerated the threat and locked medical response at a distance. And by the time the perimeter was relaxed, the count had already hardened. 11 confirmed dead, several more wounded, and no single explanation that fit the positions of the bodies or the number of weapons recovered. Because not all of the guns were found, and not all of the men who had fired them were present anymore. And that absence would quietly shape the rest of the investigation. Because without a clean chain of custody or a single suspect to absorb responsibility, the focus shifted towards stabilizing the story rather than unraveling it. Witnesses were separated and interviewed quickly, many still intoxicated, some injured, most uncertain about timing, sequence, or who fired first, and those uncertainties were recorded as contradictions rather than signals, which allowed investigators to group events together instead of tracing them, collapsing the timeline into a single disturbance that escalated, a phrase that suggested inevitability rather than accumulation. And within hours, the town was already receiving a simplified version through local radio. A bar fight gone wrong, alcohol involved, firearms present, details pending, and by morning that version had been reinforced by official statements that emphasized disorder and removed specificity. No mention of the insult. No mention of the pauses. No mention of the moments when nothing happened and something still could have been stopped. Because those moments complicated accountability. And accountability was already becoming diffuse, split across individuals who would later be charged with lesser offenses, weapons violations, reckless endangerment, obstruction, but not with carrying the full weight of 11 deaths. Because no single act could be isolated as the decisive one. And the system was not designed to prosecute a chain, only points. And so the narrative settled into a shape that allowed the town to move forward without understanding what it had passed through. Memorial services were held separately. Families grieved privately. The bar closed temporarily and reopened under a different name. Months later, the parking lot was repaved, the windows replaced, and by the end of the year the location no longer resembled the photographs taken that night. Which meant that memory became abstract, easier to ignore, easier to misremember. And when later inquiries attempted to revisit the case, they ran into missing statements, unlogged evidence transfers, and witnesses who had left the state or died themselves. And the question of who fired which shot became less important than the realization that the structure of the night itself had allowed the count to rise, because the deaths were not simultaneous. They were sequential, spaced by minutes that were filled with hesitation, misinterpretation, and the absence of intervention. And that spacing is what allowed 11 men to die over a sentence that could not be quoted, in a room that no longer existed as it had, in a town that preferred not to explain how it had failed to stop something that never announced itself as a massacre until it already was. In the weeks that followed, the investigation slowed, not because there was nothing left to examine, but because each additional fact made the case harder to contain. Ballistics confirmed at least 3 distinct firearms had been used, possibly 4, yet only 2 were recovered. One found under a table wiped clean of prints. The other discovered days later in a drainage ditch several blocks away, rust already forming, suggesting it had been discarded almost immediately. And when investigators attempted to trace ownership, they ran into informal transfers, borrowed weapons, guns purchased years earlier with incomplete records, a common reality in rural areas at the time, but one that now erased clear lines of responsibility, because each missing link forced the case away from precision and toward approximation. And approximation does not support major charges. Meanwhile, witness statements continued to shift, not dramatically, but subtly. Details adjusting as people sobered up, spoke to attorneys, spoke to family, and heard the same simplified version repeated on the radio and in the paper until memory began to align with narrative rather than experience. Because the human mind tends to smooth chaos when given a template. And the template provided was a bar fight that escalated, not a chain of preventable decisions. So the insult became vague. The first punch became mutual. The first shot became inevitable. And the time between events collapsed in retelling, which helped no one understand why people stayed as long as they did, or why exits were not used sooner. And when a grand jury was convened, it faced a problem it could not resolve. There was no single defendant whose actions could be isolated as the cause of all 11 deaths. And there was no appetite for charging multiple individuals with equal responsibility when intent varied and fear was documented. So indictments were narrow, technical, survivable, resulting in sentences that did not match the number. And the number itself began to lose weight as it passed through legal language that treated each death as separate rather than cumulative. And families noticed this immediately, not because they expected vengeance, but because they expected recognition of scale. And that recognition never arrived. Instead, they received paperwork, delays, sealed records, and explanations that emphasized complexity as if complexity absolved outcome. And over time, the town absorbed that stance because acknowledging that 11 men died over a sentence spoken in a crowded room required accepting that no safeguard intervened, not the bartender, not other patrons, not the presence of law enforcement nearby. Not the unwritten rules of familiarity that small towns rely on. And that level of failure is harder to live with than the idea of an unpredictable eruption. So the latter became the accepted explanation. And as years passed, the incident was referenced less as a massacre and more as an anomaly. A tragic night, an unfortunate convergence. Phrases that softened edges without erasing facts, but did dull them. And when anniversaries passed, they were rarely marked publicly, not out of disrespect, but out of discomfort. Because revisiting the night required reconstructing the sequence, and reconstructing the sequence led back to the realization that the first minutes were quiet, slow, undecided, and that nothing forced the escalation except the absence of interruption. And that absence was not malicious. It was ordinary. It was people assuming someone else would act, that someone else would speak, that someone else would step in. And by the time that assumption was disproven, 11 men were already dead. And the bar, rebuilt and renamed, continued operating without acknowledging what its walls had once contained, which meant the story survived only in fragments. In court transcripts rarely read, in police logs filed and forgotten, and in the memories of those who left town because staying meant being reminded that a single insult, left unchallenged long enough, had been allowed to multiply into a number the town never learned how to say out loud. Years later, when journalists and independent researchers attempted to reconstruct the night, they found that the official record resisted sequence. Reports listed times without context, actions without proximity, statements without linkage, creating a documentation field that appeared thorough but functioned as insulation, because it allowed the event to be cited without being understood. And this mattered because understanding required accepting that the violence did not erupt as a single act, but unfolded as a process, one that fed on delay and misreading. And when survivors were interviewed long after the fact, away from courtrooms and town limits, their recollections converged on the same unsettling detail: that there were multiple moments when the situation felt unstable but not yet fatal. Moments when people still believed the worst outcome would be a broken nose or a night in jail. And those beliefs governed their choices. People stayed to watch, to intervene verbally, to wait for someone else to leave first. And that waiting created density, and density created targets. And once weapons entered the space, the density turned every shot into a potential chain reaction, because movement itself became interpreted as threat. And this interpretation spread faster than any single individual could correct it. And by the time clarity returned, there was no one left who could benefit from it. And this is why the number rose gradually rather than instantly, why the dead were found in different positions, why some wounds suggested retreat while others suggested confrontation, and why the event resisted the language of a shooting and behaved more like a structural collapse, one decision weakening the next until the system failed entirely. And this framing never entered official discussion because it implied that prevention was possible, not through extraordinary measures, but through ordinary interruption. Someone refusing to let the exchange continue, someone forcing separation early, someone closing the bar temporarily, someone calling for help before weapons were visible. And these hypotheticals were uncomfortable because they implicated everyone without accusing anyone. And communities are not built to process shared responsibility for outcomes they did not intend. So the story was kept narrow, legally tidy, emotionally distant. And as a result, it faded, not because it was small, but because it was too large to fit into the categories available at the time. And when the town changed, when factories closed and families moved and new people arrived, the incident slipped further into abstraction, referenced occasionally but never examined. And the physical space continued its quiet erasure. Renovations removed remaining scars, owners changed, licenses renewed, and nothing marked the building as a site of mass death, which meant that memory had no anchor. And without an anchor, even documented events begin to drift, becoming rumors, then footnotes, then silence. And in that silence, the lesson of the night was lost. Not the moral lesson, but the operational one. The understanding that violence does not require planning to scale. It only requires enough people to misjudge the moment at the same time. And this is what ultimately defined the Ohio night of 1981. Not the insult itself, which no one could quote accurately, but the collective hesitation that followed it, the seconds and minutes where nothing decisive happened, where people assumed normal rules still applied, and by the time it was clear they did not. The count had already exceeded anything the town was prepared to name, let alone remember. What made the night particularly resistant to later reconstruction was the absence of a climax. There was no single frame that could be isolated as the turning point. No moment when everyone in the room understood simultaneously that they were inside something irreversible, because the violence arrived in increments, each one small enough to be misread. And this incremental quality confused not only the people present, but also the institutions tasked with explaining what had occurred. Because institutions prefer peaks, they prefer moments that can be cited, timestamps that can be emphasized, acts that can be labeled as decisive. And this event offered none of that. Instead, it offered a staircase, each step shallow enough that no one noticed how high they were climbing until the fall became unavoidable. And when later analysts attempted to impose a structure on the night, they repeatedly failed at the same point. Identifying the insult as the cause explained nothing about the duration. Identifying the firearms explained nothing about the spread. Identifying alcohol explained nothing about the restraint that preceded the collapse. Because intoxication alone does not create 11 fatalities over 2 hours without interruption. What created the outcome was continuity. The uninterrupted continuation of a volatile environment that no one shut down. And this continuity extended even after the first deaths, because the arrival of police did not immediately end the risk. It only froze it in place long enough for interpretation to begin, and interpretation favored containment over exposure, meaning the story that emerged was one that could be closed, legally and psychologically, rather than one that demanded ongoing examination. And this choice shaped how the night was remembered beyond the town itself. Regional papers carried brief summaries. National coverage never arrived. The absence of a clear motive or single perpetrator made the incident difficult to package. And without packaging, there was no audience. And without an audience, there was no pressure to preserve detail. So archives remained thin, files remained sealed, and the case drifted into the category of events that are known to have happened but are not known well enough to be understood. And this category is where systemic failures tend to hide, because they do not announce themselves as such. They masquerade as unfortunate alignments. And when decades later the event was mentioned in broader studies of mass violence, it was often excluded for the same reason. It did not conform to the template. It did not begin with intent and end with resolution. It began with language and ended with absence. And that absence extended to the men who were never charged, to the weapons never recovered, to the questions never asked publicly, and to the cultural mechanisms that might have prevented repetition. And the final erasure occurred not through censorship, but through normalization. As bars reopened, nights passed, arguments occurred without consequence, reinforcing the belief that the night of 11 deaths had been an anomaly rather than a warning. And this belief persisted because it was useful. It allowed people to continue behaving as they had before, without acknowledging that the margin between ordinary conflict and irreversible outcome was thinner than they wanted to admit. And so the story settled into obscurity. Not because it lacked impact, but because it challenged the assumption that catastrophe requires extremity, when in reality, it often requires only the ordinary to continue unbroken for too long. The men who died that night were not remembered together, and that fragmentation mirrored how the event itself had unfolded, each death isolated by circumstance, even as they were bound by proximity, because some were known as regulars, others as visitors, some as fathers, others as co-workers. And the absence of a single narrative frame meant their names were recalled in different contexts and at different times, never forming a unified account that could anchor public memory. And this mattered because collective remembrance requires a shape, a way to say what happened without immediately dissolving into qualifiers. And the Ohio night resisted that. Every attempt to summarize it produced discomfort, either by minimizing the count or by exaggerating the cause. So people stopped trying, and over time the incident became something older residents remembered indirectly, as a reason certain habits changed briefly and then returned, as a warning parents mentioned without details, as a story told without a beginning or an end. And when newer generations heard about it, they heard it as rumor, stripped of sequence and consequence, which made it easier to dismiss as a product of a different era rather than a function of conditions that still existed. And this distancing was reinforced by the legal aftermath, because without a central trial, there was no focal point for public reckoning, no weeks-long exposure of facts, no cross-examinations that forced contradictions into the open. Instead, there were quiet proceedings, plea agreements, sealed testimonies, and sentences that appeared disconnected from the scale of loss. And this quietness extended to institutional reflection. No policy reviews were publicized. No statewide discussions followed. No industry standards were revised in response. And the absence of visible response sent a message that the system had absorbed the shock without learning from it. That the event was complete, closed, and resolved, even though nothing about it had been resolved. And in that sense, the night did not end when the last body was removed. It ended when attention shifted away, because attention is the mechanism by which meaning is assigned. And once attention moved on, the event lost its capacity to instruct, becoming instead a static reference point, something that could be cited but not interrogated. And this is why later comparisons to other incidents failed, because those incidents had names, faces, manifestos, timelines. Whereas this one had none of those. It had only a location that continued to function and a trigger that could not be quoted. And that combination made it uniquely forgettable despite its scale. Because scale alone does not guarantee memory, coherence does, and the Ohio night offered none. It offered dispersion, overlap, and absence. And this absence allowed the community to continue without integrating the event into its identity, which may have been necessary for survival, but came at the cost of understanding, because understanding would have required accepting that 11 deaths were not the result of an extraordinary intrusion, but of ordinary dynamics left unchecked. And that acceptance would have implicated not just individuals, but environments, norms, and assumptions. And those are harder to hold accountable. So the story remained incomplete by design, not through conspiracy, but through convenience. Because forgetting was easier than reconstructing a night that demonstrated how quickly the ordinary could fail when no one interrupts it. When the building changed hands again in the late 1990s, the new owner requested records for routine licensing and was given nothing that distinguished the address from any other. No notation that mass fatalities had occurred there. No requirement for disclosure. No institutional memory attached to the walls, which meant that the site entered a second phase of erasure, one where even indirect acknowledgement vanished, and patrons who drank there years later did so without any awareness that the floor beneath them had once held bodies arranged by chance and timing rather than intent. And this absence mattered because physical spaces often carry memory longer than people do, but only if that memory is allowed to remain visible. And here it was not. It was scrubbed by renovations and paperwork and the simple passage of time. And the same process occurred with the records themselves. Files archived without prioritization, some misfiled, some lost to routine purges, some rendered inaccessible by format changes, meaning that later attempts to reconstruct the case encountered not resistance, but emptiness. A lack of connective tissue between documents that were never designed to be read together, because at the time, no one believed they would need to be. And this belief extended to the witnesses who survived, many of whom never spoke publicly again. Not because they were silenced, but because there was no forum that demanded their full account, no proceeding that required them to reconcile their memory with others. And without that pressure, recollections remained private, unchallenged, and therefore mutable, changing subtly with each retelling until they no longer matched the night itself. And this mutability fed back into the narrative gap, making later synthesis nearly impossible. Because when accounts diverge without a stable reference point, the tendency is to average them into something smooth. And smoothness removes edges, removes friction, removes the very features that explain escalation. So what remained was a generalized sense of tragedy without mechanism. And without mechanism, there is no prevention, only mourning. And mourning without mechanism eventually exhausts itself, turning into background noise. And this is why the incident never entered broader discussions of public safety or violence prevention. It offered no villain and no lesson that could be reduced to policy language. It suggested that the difference between a loud night and a fatal one could be measured in minutes and social cues rather than laws, and that suggestion was inconvenient because it placed responsibility in spaces that were informal and therefore difficult to regulate. So the system responded by omission, by allowing the event to exist without a framework. And over time, that omission became the dominant feature of the story, more influential than any single shot fired, because it determined how the event would be remembered or not remembered. And as decades passed, the few remaining primary witnesses aged, moved, or died, taking with them details that were never recorded because no one asked for them in full. And when the last of them were gone, the event crossed a threshold, moving from something that could still be reconstructed with effort into something that could only be approximated. And approximation is the final stage of forgetting, because it replaces sequence with summary and experience with label. And the label that remained was insufficient to convey what had actually occurred, reducing 11 deaths to a shorthand phrase that explained nothing about how easily the count had risen. And in that reduction, the night achieved its final form, not as a warning or a case study, but as an anomaly filed away, its most important characteristic not the number of dead, but the fact that no one could say precisely how it happened without first dismantling the assumptions that allowed it to be forgotten. By the early 2000s, the Ohio Night of 1981 existed almost entirely as an administrative artifact, a line item in crime statistics, an unresolved reference in regional databases, stripped of narrative and therefore stripped of force. And this transformation was not accidental, but procedural, because systems remember what they are designed to measure. And what happened that night resisted measurement. It did not conform to categories of motive, offender, or event type. And so it was flattened into something countable, but not interpretable, which allowed it to persist without demanding action. And this flattening extended even to academic treatments of mass violence, where the incident was either excluded for lack of clarity or misclassified as a single shooter event despite evidence to the contrary. And each misclassification further erased the structure of the night, replacing complexity with convenience. And the effect of that replacement was cumulative, because future readers encountering the incident encountered it already simplified, already stripped of the features that made it instructive. And once a simplified version enters circulation, it tends to overwrite primary accounts, especially when those accounts are fragmented and inaccessible. So the night became something that could be referenced without being reconstructed. And this distinction matters because reconstruction forces confrontation with process, while reference allows distance. And distance was what the town, the institutions, and the broader public ultimately chose. Not through denial, but through inertia, because inertia requires no justification. It is the default state once urgency fades, and urgency faded quickly after the immediate aftermath, as it often does when no single figure can be blamed and no single reform can be proposed. And the men who died became statistics before they became a case study. Their deaths absorbed into aggregate numbers that obscured sequence. And sequence was the key to understanding why the event mattered beyond its count, because the count alone suggested rarity, while the sequence suggested vulnerability. A vulnerability that did not depend on ideology, planning, or extremism, only on the continuation of ordinary conflict in an environment that lacked interruption. And this insight remained largely unspoken, because speaking it would have required acknowledging that prevention was not a matter of extraordinary intervention, but of ordinary decisiveness. And ordinary decisiveness is difficult to legislate, difficult to assign, and difficult to celebrate, so it was ignored. and as years passed, the physical traces disappeared entirely. The bar's name changed again, then again. The clientele shifted. The road was repaved, and nothing in the landscape indicated that the site had once concentrated violence long enough to produce 11 deaths, which meant that any future conflict occurring there would be interpreted in isolation rather than in continuity. And this is how forgetting functions at a structural level. It removes context so that repetition appears unrelated. And although no event of similar scale occurred at that location again, smaller incidents did. Fights, threats, weapons brandished but not used. Each one resolved just in time, reinforcing the belief that the night of 1981 had been exceptional, when in fact it had followed the same early pattern, only without interruption, and this selective memory allowed the lesson to remain dormant, waiting, unarticulated, because the conditions it described did not disappear, they persisted quietly, embedded in social spaces where conflict is managed informally and escalation is assumed to be unlikely. And as long as that assumption holds, the story remains safely abstract. But abstraction is fragile. It can collapse back into reality without warning, just as it did that winter night, when a sentence spoken without foresight was allowed to linger long enough to acquire weight. And that weight, once set in motion, proved impossible to stop with anything less than the attention that never came. The most telling detail, when the night is examined without compression, is not who pulled a trigger, but who assumed the situation was still manageable, because that assumption appears repeatedly across accounts, in statements where witnesses describe thinking it would burn out, where they expected raised voices to replace raised weapons, where they believed familiarity would function as restraint. And this belief shaped behavior in subtle but decisive ways. People delayed leaving because they did not want to appear afraid. Others stayed because they felt responsible for calming things down. Some remained because they were waiting for an apology that never came. And these motivations were ordinary, socially conditioned, and entirely reasonable in environments where escalation is rare. But rarity does not equal impossibility. And the night demonstrated how quickly norms collapse once the first irreversible act occurs, because after that point, every attempt at normal behavior becomes misaligned with reality. And this misalignment compounds. Someone shouts instead of moving. Someone moves instead of hiding. Someone intervenes instead of disengaging. And each misstep is interpreted by someone else as intent. And intent is what weapons respond to, not context. And once this dynamic takes hold, the environment itself becomes hostile. Not because of ideology or planning, but because perception has lost synchronization. Everyone is reacting to a different version of events, some to what just happened, others to what they believe is about to happen. And no one has the full picture. And in that gap, violence scales without direction, producing casualties that appear random but are in fact structured by proximity and timing, which explains why some men were struck while moving away and others while standing still, why some were hit inside and others outside, why the distribution of bodies made no tactical sense, because there was no tactic, only reaction layered upon reaction. And this is why later attempts to assign motive failed. Motive implies continuity of intent, and intent dissolved quickly after the first shots, replaced by reflex, fear, and misinterpretation. And reflex does not leave a paper trail. It does not produce manifestos or coherent explanations. It produces silence afterward, because reflexive acts are difficult to justify once time has passed, and those who survived often struggled to articulate why they did what they did, not because they were lying, but because the reasons were not linguistic. They were situational, emerging from a moment that no longer existed, and this made the event resistant to moral framing as well. Because morality prefers clear choices, and the night offered none, only constrained options chosen under uncertainty, and acknowledging that reality would have required a different kind of public conversation. One focused on environments rather than individuals, on pacing rather than blame, on interruption rather than punishment. And such conversations were rare at the time and remain rare now, because they do not produce satisfying conclusions, they do not reassure, they complicate. And the Ohio night did not need complication added to it. It already contained more than the community could process. So it was allowed to dissolve into a cautionary absence rather than a studied example. And in doing so, it joined a category of events that are statistically visible but culturally invisible, present in numbers but absent in narrative. And this absence is itself a risk, because it leaves future actors without reference points, without stories that explain how quickly the ordinary can fail. And without those stories, the same assumptions persist: that familiarity will restrain, that conflict will peak and recede, that someone else will intervene, and those assumptions are what allowed 11 men to die over a sentence that was never recorded, in a space that no longer acknowledged it had ever happened. And that final disconnection between cause and memory is what ensured the night would be forgotten even as the conditions that produced it remained intact. Waiting for another pause, another misreading, another moment where nothing decisive happens until it is too late. What remains after the details erode is a pattern that does not belong to one town or one decade, because the mechanics visible that night were not unique to the location or the people involved. They were generic, transferable, and therefore more dangerous than any single offender, because they depended on shared expectations rather than individual intent. Expectations about how conflict behaves, about how quickly situations resolve themselves, about how rare catastrophic outcomes are in familiar places. And those expectations functioned as a kind of social blind spot, delaying recognition until recognition no longer mattered. And this blind spot was reinforced by the environment itself, a space designed for closeness, noise, alcohol, and informal regulation. All factors that normally coexist without incident, but collectively reduce the margin for error when something deviates. And on that night, deviation was subtle at first, verbal rather than physical, personal rather than public. And it was this subtlety that allowed the chain to continue, because nothing announced itself as exceptional early enough to trigger decisive interruption. And by the time weapons appeared, the environment had already lost its capacity to self-correct, which is why later calls for responsible behavior rang hollow. Responsibility assumes agency, and agency had already been compromised by misperception and delay. And this does not absolve individuals of their actions, but it does explain why focusing exclusively on individuals fails to prevent repetition, because it ignores the conditions that amplify error. And those conditions persisted unchanged after the night ended. Bars continued to operate the same way. Conflict continued to be managed informally. Weapons remained accessible. And the belief that escalation was unlikely remained intact, because the event itself had been framed as unlikely. An outlier, a convergence of bad luck, rather than as a demonstration of how thin the line between ordinary and catastrophic actually was. And this framing was comfortable. It allowed people to return to routines without revising assumptions. But comfort came at the cost of insight, because insight would have required acknowledging that prevention does not always look like control or enforcement. It sometimes looks like interruption without justification, separation without negotiation, closure without explanation. Actions that feel excessive in the moment but are minimal compared to the cost of waiting. And the Ohio night showed what waiting produces when enough people wait simultaneously. It produces density, confusion, and eventually irreversible outcomes. And the fact that this lesson did not enter public consciousness is not surprising. It challenged deeply held beliefs about predictability and fairness, about the idea that extreme outcomes require extreme causes, when in reality they often require only the continuation of ordinary processes beyond the point where they are safe. And this misalignment between belief and reality is what allowed the night to recede into obscurity, because stories that contradict foundational assumptions are harder to retain. They create cognitive friction, and friction is usually resolved by forgetting, not by adaptation. And so the event remained available only to those willing to reconstruct it, piece by piece, to resist compression, to hold multiple partial truths without forcing them into a single explanation. And this resistance is rare, not because it is difficult, but because it is uncomfortable. It refuses closure. It refuses villain and redemption. It leaves only a structure that failed gradually and predictably. And gradual, predictable failure is the least satisfying form of catastrophe, because it implies that nothing dramatic was required to stop it, only attention applied earlier than felt necessary. And this implication lingers unspoken in the absence left behind, shaping the story not through what is said, but through what is avoided. And in that avoidance, the night remains unresolved. Not legally, not emotionally, but structurally. Its lessons intact but unclaimed, waiting in the background of similar spaces where conflict is assumed to be manageable, until, without warning, it is not. By the time 4 decades had passed, the Ohio night had crossed from memory into pattern without ever being acknowledged as such, existing in the background of similar incidents that were discussed as isolated failures rather than related outcomes. Because once an event loses its narrative integrity, it can no longer anchor comparison. It cannot be used as a reference point, and without reference points, repetition appears coincidental. Each case treated as new, despite sharing the same structural conditions. And this is how the night continued to matter without being named, influencing risk without influencing response, because the factors that produced it remained embedded in everyday environments where people rely on informal rules to manage escalation. And informal rules work until they do not, until the moment they are exceeded without warning, and that moment is rarely recognized in real time, because it looks like every other moment that resolved itself before. And the danger lies precisely there, in the familiarity that delays action, in the assumption that the present resembles the past closely enough to predict the future. And on that winter night, the assumption held just long enough to be fatal. And once broken, it could not be repaired retroactively, which is why the event defied closure. There was no corrective action that could be pointed to afterward, no reform that could convincingly claim to address what had happened. Because what had happened was not a breach of protocol, but the absence of one, not a violation, but an expectation. And expectations are rarely regulated. They are inherited, reinforced through repetition, and rarely questioned until they fail. And when they fail, the tendency is to isolate the failure rather than examine the expectation itself, because examining expectations implicates everyone who shares them, and shared implication is uncomfortable. It resists blame assignment. It resists punishment. It resists resolution. And so it is usually avoided. And avoidance became the final mechanism by which the Ohio night disappeared from active consideration, not erased, but sidelined, accessible but unused, present but inert. And this inertia is what allows similar dynamics to persist elsewhere. Because without explicit acknowledgement of how ordinary conditions can scale into mass harm, prevention efforts remain focused on outliers, on identifying dangerous individuals rather than dangerous sequences, on responding to peaks rather than flattening trajectories. And the Ohio night offered a clear example of trajectory-based failure, a gradual escalation facilitated by delay, misinterpretation, and the diffusion of responsibility. Yet without a narrative frame to preserve that example, it was lost to abstraction. And abstraction does not instruct behavior, it only decorates statistics. And so the night's true significance remained dormant, embedded in the gaps between what was recorded and what was understood. And those gaps are where future outcomes incubate, because they allow the same assumptions to operate unchecked. The same belief that someone else will intervene, that the situation will resolve itself, that escalation requires intent rather than accumulation. And until those assumptions are challenged explicitly, they continue to govern behavior, quietly shaping environments where the margin for error is thinner than acknowledged. And this is why the Ohio night remains relevant despite its obscurity, not as a singular tragedy, but as a demonstration of how easily the ordinary can produce the irreversible when left uninterrupted. And the fact that this demonstration was never fully integrated into public understanding is not an accident. It is a consequence of how societies manage discomfort, by reducing it to silence rather than expanding it into insight. And in that silence, the lesson waits, intact, not forgotten because it is insignificant, but forgotten because it is too close to how things usually work. When the night is reduced to what cannot be argued away, what remains is not a mystery, but a condition. 11 men died because a volatile environment was allowed to remain intact long after it had stopped being safe. And everything else, the insult, the alcohol, the weapons, the individual decisions, functioned inside that condition rather than creating it. Because none of those elements were new to the space, they had existed there many nights before without consequence, which is why the danger went unrecognized until recognition no longer had utility. And this is the final distortion that allowed the event to disappear. The belief that repetition without disaster implies safety, when in reality it only implies delay. And the Ohio night demonstrated how delay accumulates, how each minute without interruption adds weight rather than diffuses it, how familiarity dulls urgency, and how the absence of a decisive moment early on guarantees the presence of irreversible ones later. And once that threshold is crossed, there is no action that restores the previous state, only actions that limit further damage. Which is why the count stopped at 11, not because the system corrected itself, but because it exhausted its available participants. And this exhaustion was later mistaken for resolution, as if the night had ended naturally rather than simply run out of bodies and movement. And this misreading carried forward into memory, shaping how the story was stored, retold, and eventually ignored. Because events that appear to resolve themselves are rarely examined for how close they came to becoming worse. And the Ohio night came close repeatedly, not in seconds, but in minutes. Long enough for intervention to matter, short enough for it to be postponed. And that postponement was collective, distributed across dozens of people who each believed they were not yet required to act. And when responsibility is distributed evenly, it becomes invisible. And invisibility is the final stage of erasure. Because what cannot be seen cannot be named, and what cannot be named cannot be prevented. And this is why the story ends without closure. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because closure would imply that something was resolved. When in reality nothing was, the conditions remained, the assumptions persisted, the environment continued to function as before. And the only thing that changed was that 11 men did not return home. And that absence was absorbed quietly, folded into routine, stripped of sequence and context until it became a statistic rather than a warning. And in that form, it posed no challenge, demanded no adjustment, and required no memory beyond acknowledgement. And that is how a night defined by accumulation was ultimately undone by reduction. Not reduced because it was simple, but reduced because complexity was inconvenient. And the final consequence of that reduction is not found in archives or court records, but in the continued belief that catastrophic outcomes announce themselves clearly before they arrive. When the Ohio night demonstrated the opposite, that they arrive gradually, disguised as normality, advancing one unchallenged moment at a time, until there is nothing left to interrupt and no one left who can pretend they did not see it coming.